Thanks again for everybody's attendance. Hopefully you're enjoying your lunch. Just wanted to make a couple of brief comments about the speaker today. I'll go through this rather rapidly. The bonds of business, family, and friendship between Houston and Mexico are deep and enduring. We share a common vision and mutual responsibility for building a safer, more democratic, and prosperous hemisphere. Today, we see how economic instability in Europe and concerns about the U.S. economy are affecting worldwide financial markets. But in this context of turbulence, Mexico is experiencing an economic resurgence that seems poised for strong growth in the next few years. Some observers are talking about the rise of the Aztec tiger. The nation of about 115 million, currently the 14th largest economy, could be among the world's 10 biggest economies by the end of the decade. It is expected to compete in the manufacturing sector and other sectors with China, India, Brazil, and other countries. For all of this, we turn to President Felipe Calderon, a leader who strengthened the bonds between Mexico and America, and whose courage, vision, and commitment built the foundation for a very bright future for Mexico. The President's accomplishments are closely linked to his training in law and economics. And unfortunately today I don't have enough time to speak about all of them, but we'll touch upon a few. First, in economic terms, Mexico is looking to the future with renewed confidence. 15 years of sound political and monetary policies are beginning to pay off. The total debt of the federal government is less than 1/3 of GDP, and foreign reserves are equivalent to 2.5 times the government's foreign debt. The fiscal deficit is less than 0.5% of GDP, and the economy grew last year by over 5%, and inflation stands around 3% today. Mexico is economically, socially, and politically stable, and will be in a great position to weather storms, if any, in the future. President Calderon reduced the number of people living in poverty by 50% during his tenure. He has worked to increase competition, and as a result, the middle class continues to grow and be vibrant. Home ownership is also on the rise, and I think 850,000 jobs were created in Mexico alone in 2012. That is the fastest pace that Mexico has had in the last decade. Truly impressive. Education and health are also at the heart of the people's well-being. Today, there is universal education in Mexico for the first time in the country's history. 24 million education grants have been awarded to students from elementary to postgraduate school just in the last few years. And 96 new institutions of higher education have been established, the majority oriented towards science and technology. Therefore, a competitive workforce is to come and to bear in the future. And whereas only a decade ago, only half of the population had health coverage, today more than 100 million Mexicans have access to public health services. Universal health coverage is expected to be fully in place by the end of the year. Now, this record that I have described is quite tremendous and impressive for any leader, but it is especially striking against the backdrop of Mexico's security challenges. President Calderon's unyielding stance against criminal gangs has resulted in significant gains in the national security, which will assist that country further into the future. History will be the judge, but as we stand here today, I believe that this is Mexico's moment, that Hecho en Mexico, made in Mexico, will become as common in the next 15 years as made in China has been for the last 15, ushering in a bright future that began under the leadership of Felipe Calderon. Presidente Calderon, es un placer tenerlo con nosotros el día de hoy, esperando así su presentación. Full speed ahead, realizing Mexico's potential, or a gran velocidad, realizando el potencial de México. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you His Excellency Felipe Calderon, 56th President of Mexico.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Look forward to your presentation. Awards. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your words. Good afternoon. It is an honor for me and a pleasure to be here with you in Houston. I sincerely thank my friends at the Houston World Affairs Council for their kind invitation. In particular, I want to express my gratitude to the Council Chairman, John Bretz, and to Mark, Linda, and all the team that made this possible. I applaud the goals of the Council. By promoting America's understanding of the world, the Houston World Affairs Council is contributing to stronger links between this great nation and its partners and allies around the globe. With its work, the Council promotes America's necessary understanding of Mexico. Back in 2007, I remember when I saw George W. Bush during a presidential meeting, and again in 2009 when I received President Obama in Mexico City. I told both presidents that my country and the United States had the extraordinary opportunity to begin a new era in our relationship. A new era in which we work to make our common border an example of productivity, growth, and security. A new era in which we work together to increase North America's competitiveness. A new era in which the fight against crime is taken up as a shared responsibility. A new stage of understanding between our peoples in which we reach a more comprehensive and fairer understanding of immigration. And during my administration, Mexico took bold steps to build this new era for North America. And today, I will share with you some reflections on what we did in some key areas, in particular, the economy and the rule of law in our country. First, let me tell you about how we transformed the Mexican economy during these years. But before, let me remember that only 4 years ago, Mexico went through one of the most difficult moments in its recent economic history. On one side, there was the impact of the crisis in the United States. Because 80% of even more of our exports come here to the States, the American contraction hit our economy harder than anywhere else. Second, we faced at that time declining government revenues as oil production fell. Third, at that particular moment, there was the swine flu outbreak. You can imagine to know that a previously unknown and lethal virus whose initial outbreak happened exactly in one of the largest cities in the world, Mexico City. And as the economy entered recession, criminal violence rose rapidly. For me, in that spring of 2009, it seems that Mexico had been hit by the perfect storm. We had to act, and we had to act quickly. We needed to deal with the crisis, but at the same time, we decided to take the opportunity of that moment to increase the Mexican competitiveness. And let me explain what we did starting on the economic side. First, my government implemented all the available counter-cyclical measures to mitigate the impact of the recession, especially in favor of the poorest people, and save as many jobs as possible in the Mexican economy. Yes, we expanded public expenditures in that year. We expanded public deficit. We gave support, for instance, to 6.5 million poorest families in the country by widening from 5 to 6.5 millions and strengthening the conditional cash transfer program addressed to combat poverty called Oportunidades. And we needed to be very creative at that year. For instance, one of the most affected areas of the economy was the export sector, as you can imagine. So to protect the export-oriented jobs, automotive industry, electronics, a lot of manufacturers, for instance, we reached an agreement between the government, the workers, the companies, and the unions. And the deal was like this. If the workers accepted a pay cut in their salaries, and companies accepted to pay workers a part of their salaries instead of firing them, then the federal government accepted to pay to workers the other part of their salary for 3 to 6 months. And in that way, we saved almost 500,000 jobs in the export-oriented sector in the economy. And we also tried similar things in other areas. For instance, in all those very poor communities, mainly in rural areas, we organized and implemented a temporary jobs program in order to pay a salary to any people who wants to participate in community services, for instance, maintaining roads or cleaning archaeological sites or preventing wood fires and others. Again, to 3 to 6 months. Second, on the other hand, we kept a strong commitment to sound fiscal policies. Of course, the counter-cyclical measures, the expansion of the public expenditure, made us increase the fiscal deficit. But we knew that this is a one-shot weapon. In other words, these kind of measures can only be applied once, and we did so. Many economies, by the way, many economies made stimulus a permanent measure and rolled into economic crises that are still unsolved. And that is the case of several countries in Europe. For these reasons, in order to keep public finances under control, a few months later, in that year, 2009, and when we realized that the economy was bouncing back, we implemented an exit strategy following a very old recipe, reducing, expanding, and increasing revenues. So there is nothing new under the sun. So the strategy included some very tough decisions from the political point of view. For instance, increasing taxes or price of gasoline, which even today is below the international price, and closing a large and very inefficient state utility, Luz y Fuerza del Centro, Light and Power, which cost taxpayers $5 billion a year only in subsidies. I was talking a few minutes ago that the contract with the union in Luz y Fuerza was so weird. For instance, the union opposed and blocked the use of computers in the offices of Luz y Fuerza. Why? Because computers threats the labor force. So if you have to clarify your consumption of electricity, you need to go to the office of Luz y Fuerza, make a very long line, and maybe you can fix your consumption, which is written with pencil in a paper. in that office. So it was very inefficient, very expensive, so we shut down the company that year. 44,000 employees. Third, we got the reduction in the deficit. Fortunately, because very few months later, most of the countries that didn't take the brave decisions of reduce the deficit got into serious problems with financial markets. During my tenure, by the way, we put in place an ambitious infrastructure program which raised annual investment in roads, ports, and airports, energy facilities, and other projects from 3 to 5% of GDP a year. $50 billion were invested in Mexico a year in infrastructure. And we did so, of course, widening public expenditure for infrastructure, but also allowing private sector to participate in most. Very important measure, we changed the law in order to allow that, but also we created a special fund, infrastructure fund. We sold to private sector, for instance, highways, toll highways already in place, and with that money we were able to build another highways. For instance, the Mazatlan-Durango highway, which cost probably more than $2 billion. And this highway has, for instance, 82 tunnels. We built more tunnels in that highway than the total amount of tunnels and kilometers of tunnel built in Mexico in the last 25 years. That highway has more than 100 bridges, and among them, the highest bridge in its type is the Baluarte Bridge, which it has 500 meters from the last column in Sinaloa to the first column in Durango, and 400 rivers between the bridge and the river in Sinaloa. So we invested a lot in infrastructure. For instance, we built or renewed more than 23,000 kilometers of roads and highways in Mexico. That is the distance between North Pole and South Pole in America. And many of them connecting production clusters, for instance, automotive industry clusters, with major borders, crossing, and port facilities. And we also invested in modernizing important border crossing points. For instance, we built the first railroad border crossing, the first railroad border crossing bridge in 100 years. And precisely we built that in the border with Texas, between Matamoros and Brownsville. And not only that, we also built 3 new modern and efficient border crossing facilities, 2 of them in the border with Texas as well, in Reynosa and Rio Bravo. Fourth, we pushed in order to modernize our economy for structural reforms in key areas. One of them addressing a very crucial problem, not only in Mexico, but in several countries and also in the United States, the pension system. So we went from the traditional system of pay-as-you-go to one of individual retirement accounts for public servants. Only with the change we made to the pension system, we saved 30% of GDP, 30 points of GDP at net present value to public finances by reducing potential public sector entitlements. We also implemented tax reforms in order to increase non-oil public revenues, and we passed an energy reform to boost declining oil production levels. Lastly, at the end of my term, we also reached a reform to the labor law to provide more flexibility to labor markets and allow young people and women to be able to get into the labor market. So that flexibility could provide the competitiveness to the economy and the opportunities that the people need. Fifth, we kept our commitment with free trade. I do believe in freedom. I do believe in free trade. I know that consumption or production, when it's driven by market, will get the best point of production and the optimum point of consumption. So I remember, by the way, one of the G20 meetings, I don't remember it, probably in Toronto, and in that summit with the world's most important leaders, in the final communique, we said, as always, that we reject protectionism and we will support the free trades, and we will work in favor of free trade. But the next week, 15 out of 20 of these leaders had increased tariffs or introduced new trade barriers in the middle of the crisis. We, Mexicans, we did it the other way around. We opened our economy even more. We reduced tariffs from 11 to 4% on average for industry. And we continue our policy of free trade agreements. Today, Mexican products have free access to 44 countries. And that implies that a Mexican product pays no tariffs, getting access to more than 1 billion of consumers in the world. And we open the industry because Mexican competitiveness is highly correlated with manufacturing. We know if we want to produce the best SUVs, for instance, in automotive market, we needed to allow all the producers, a lot of American companies, by the way, to get the inputs coming from wherever abroad, as long there could be the best and the cheapest inputs for those SUVs. And in that way, we improve competitiveness for industry opening the market. 6, we ease doing business by cutting red tape and facilitating trade. For instance, if you are a company working in India, you need 16 days to complete an export procedure and to get the license. The same thing takes 21 days in China and 36 days in Russia. In Mexico, it takes only 12 days to get an export license. And we eliminated half of all government regulation. We erased, by decree, 16,000 regulations in 2010, after a huge procedure of cutting red tape in public administration. By the way, partly true, we organized a national contest in which we asked to the public to nominate what could be the most useless procedure, the most useless rule in federal government. As you can imagine, there were a lot of suggestions, thousands of suggestions. And finally, we got all that information and erased 16,000 rules and norms and so on. 7, I say we invested in public works, infrastructure, but also, and mainly, we invested in our people. For instance, we multiplied the budget since the very beginning for health services. I remember when I was president-elect, I asked to my team how to reach the goal of universal health care in Mexico. Mr. President, that is impossible. Why? Because we should multiply by 4 or by 5 the budget for instance, Seguro Popular, the popular insurance. Okay? Make it. How? You need to reduce a lot of programs that have not the same priority like this. And we, at the end of my administration, we multiplied by 5 the budget for that. And we reached, at the end of my administration, what is a goal, a dream come true for any nation. Universal health care. Universal health coverage, which means doctor, medicine, and treatment for any Mexican who needs it. To give you an idea, we not only multiply the budget for Seguro Popular, but also for infrastructure in health services. And in 6 years, we built 1,200 new clinics or hospitals in Mexico. Some of them small clinics in rural towns, but also hospitals like in Ciudad Victoria or Reynosa, you can see them, 200 or 300 beds. And we modernize and refurbish more than 2,000 more, which is by far the biggest effort in health service infrastructure in Mexico. And this measure had tremendous implication for the well-being of our people. And in some points it was very emotional for me. For instance, we decided to incorporate to Seguro Popular the cancer treatment for kids. We established a policy saying all the cancer for all the children. So for anyone of 18 years old or below, we pay full treatment for cancer. Before that measure, for instance, 7 out of 10 kids with leukemia died. Today, 7 out of 10 children with leukemia survive in Mexico. That's the difference that we found in public policy in that. And the same we did investing in our people in education, similar things. For instance, during my tenure, we built 140 new universities and technological institutes from the ground up. And we built as well more than 1,000 new high schools. And all of them, all these new universities and high school, all of them public and tuition-free centers of education. So one fact that illustrates one of the results of this, for instance, today, to say last year, Mexico has more than 90,000 engineers graduating every single year. 90,000 new engineers. That implies that Mexico is producing, if I can say that, more engineers a year than Germany, or UK, or Canada, or Brazil. And if you consider engineers per capita, if I can say that, we are graduating more engineers than US. So that effort, for instance, is not only providing opportunities for all those kids, but also it's improving in an incredible way the competitiveness of the industry. Why? Because the most competitive industries in the world are looking not for very low salaries. They can find them in other places or countries, but they are looking for quality. They are looking for very well-trained people, and they are finding that exactly in Mexico. In sum, my friends, facing the crisis was not easy, but we were able to weather the storm and deliver good results to the Mexican people. And when I left office, as Mark was saying, we reached several things. Stable inflation and interest rates at their lowest level in history in Mexico. We reduced our external debt in terms of GDP. External debt, as you know very well, was the nightmare of Latin America and Mexico during decades. And today, public debt, for instance, here in the US, is 85% of GDP. In the OECD countries, the average of public debt, or foreign debt, excuse me, is roughly like 60%. In Mexico, public debt is only 33% of GDP. Actually, we even issued a bond, a 100 years bond, which is probably one of the most rare bonds ever. Only China issued the same bond, 100 years, but the Mexican bond has a lower rate, so that's good, no? I'm afraid I'm not going to be there to pay that bond, but it was a fantastic financial operation for Mexico, but that bond demonstrated the credibility of the markets in the performance of the Mexican economy. Other things. Usually, the crises in Mexico were related with the fact that the country was unable to pay its liabilities because the central bank was out of foreign currency. That's the story of 76, 82, 87, 94. Now, our foreign exchange reserves at the central bank are at their peak, 170 billion. And actually today, our reserves are more than twice the total external debt of Mexico. I know that fiscal deficit is a big concern here and everywhere. So most of the discussions about public finances are related with fiscal deficit. I don't know, here like 6 or 7 or 8, it was 10 2 years ago of GDP. The fiscal deficit in Mexico will be almost 0 this year. And talking about competitiveness, let me just tell you some facts. Mexico today is the largest exporter of flat screens in the world and one of the most important exporters of mobile phones. For instance, almost 70% of the BlackBerries in the world are made in Mexico. Today, comparing Mexico with the rest of countries of Latin America and Caribbean, Mexico exports more manufactured goods than the rest of the Latin American and Caribbean countries put together, including Brazil. 60% of manufactured goods are coming from Mexico. When I took office, Mexico was the 9th largest exporter of vehicles in the world. Today, it is the 4th largest exporter of vehicles in the world, surpassing this year's, last 3 years, surpassing Spain and the US. And thanks to all, the Mexican economy expanded 20% in the last 3 years and a half of my tenure after the crisis. And we created more than 2 million jobs in those years, including the 800,000 that Mar was talking about. So not only that, the combination of a growing economy and increasing social expenditure has also had effects on Mexican society. Slowly but surely, Mexico is becoming a middle-class nation. That is why more Mexicans are not able to buy TVs, cars, mobile phones, and even their own homes. For instance, during my 6 years in office, almost 5 million Mexican families were able to buy their own house, a record figure. 1/4 of the total houses in Mexico were built and financed during the last 10 years in our country. And why is all of this important for the US? I can think of many reasons, but just consider one. The fact that the net immigration ratio of labor workers to the United States, which is a very sensitive issue. The net migration from Mexico to the US has diminished in recent years and finally reached 0 in 2011 and 2012. 0 net rate of immigration. Of course, this can be explained by several factors, by the increase in border security is one, and the economic downturn in the United States. But there is a strong argument that better opportunities in Mexico for education, health, and jobs are also being a key factor to reduce the net rate of immigration. Does this mean that immigration to US will stop? Of course not. It means that Mexico is day by day becoming a better neighbor. What it means is that Mexicans coming to the US are less in number and have more education and better skills. It means that the Mexican workforce is more productive and better prepared to contribute to the competitiveness of North America, both at home and abroad. And I hope that Congress in the US can move forward with a proposal on immigration reform, which is absolutely needed. That seriously will boost competitiveness both sides of the border. Now, my friends, if you allow me, the other area where we had to take bold measures was, of course, security. As you know, as president, I needed to face the very difficult problem of crime and its violence. It is my personal belief that there is no state without law, and there is no prosperity in a nation where the rule of law doesn't prevail. Therefore, my goal was to transform Mexico into a country of laws, into a secure country. Some people think wrongly that my main objective was to combat or capture drug trafficking, or to fight drugs per se. And for them, for instance, all that happened in Mexico is about what President Nixon once called war on drugs. This is very common, however, it's a very common mistake. Believe me, my priority was not to combat drugs or traffickers. I fought them, yes, but my main goal was to enforce the law and to protect the Mexican families from the threat of the criminals and their violence. That was the aim of my government, the Mexican families under threat by the criminals. When I took office, what I found is that organized crime not only was operating with full impunity. In some places, even the criminals had the full control of towns and cities, and even the police corps were under their orders. It was extreme. The criminals were ruling towns and cities in Mexico. That's what I found. Kidnappings, extortions, protection rackets were devastating the security of the families and businesses alike. So, the new business for criminals, drug retailing, by the way, that is very important. The new business for criminal drug retailing, which started as the income of Mexicans began to grow in the 90s, implied the dramatic expansion of organized crime far beyond the border. They were looking for any single point in which they can sell drugs. It could be Monterrey, which has a lot of income. It could be Cuernavaca, it could be Veracruz, it could be Acapulco. In that expansion, criminal organizations found very weak law enforcement agencies, and some of them were completely eroded by corruption. That is the truth. Those institutions, those police corps, those attorney general offices were completely eroded by corruption. So the criminals, when the criminals started to advance looking for markets and the control of territory, this takeover of the institutions was really easy. And that is exactly the problem I needed to face. In addition to that, the criminals got into very violent battles with each other. Why? Because they were trying to control one single territory. And that is very important for any retailing business. The control of multiple points of sales in one single territory is the key issue of the business. So they needed to control the territory, so they got into the battle against other criminal cartels in order to get that. So this is the main source, for instance, this battle among cartels each other. This is the main source of the violence and the cruel homicides we have observed in Mexico in the last decade. Now, once they have control of the city or the town and its agencies, they start the real new business, which is extortion. It is not only drugs anymore. The new business, the more profitable one, is extortion over the people. That's the definition of organized crime. The definition of organized crime is a group that, through violence or threats, attempts to extract rents from this society. So that's what I found when I took office. And in order to address this problem, we deploy a comprehensive strategy with three main components. I don't need to say that it was a difficult decision, but we were absolutely sure that the main obligation of any president and the government is to provide security to the people. And I didn't avoid my task. And we addressed the problem hands-on directly and put in place this comprehensive strategy with three components. One, we face criminal gangs with the full force of the state. For someone else, for instance, the easy solution was to avoid the criminals. Let them to do whatever they want. Don't get in troubles. We refuse that so-called alternative. We face the criminals with the full force of the state in places where criminal violence had left society completely helpless. I send the armed forces, I send the federal police, and I send them as a temporary measure to allow local governments to rebuild their own police forces. Two, and more important than the first one, we started from scratch a new generation of law enforcement agencies. It was the beginning of a long process of cleaning up and rebuilding the law enforcement agencies and institutions, including police corps and attorney general offices. For instance, we established by first time ever in Mexico the vetting process for top officers. So they needed to pass toxicological exam, psychological exam, even polygraph exam, in order to detect who could be reliable to be a commander or who could be reliable to be a police officer. And we apply all those exams bottom to the top to bottom in police corps at federal level. Now, the task is to do the same at local level in the states and in the municipalities. I can assure you, the day when Mexico gets reliable police corps and attorney general offices in one of each 32 states in the country, that day Mexico will change and will be the country all of us want to have in the future. And third, and most important, we began to tackle the social causes of crime. We set up programs to prevent young people from turning to crime, including scholarships, job training, as well as unprecedented investment in prevention and treatment for addictions. Thanks to this approach, cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez are making a comeback. There was a place in Ciudad Juarez in which a dozen of kids, teenagers, were killed. We rebuilt that place. We built soccer fields, American football fields, a library, a place for musicians, a community room, and in that place, 500 teenagers and youths are training and playing every day. And the parents of some of those kids who were killed in 2010, they are running the American football team. And this year, they were champions in the region, in Chihuahua and in the north. So we knew in Juarez, we invested and we built 5 new high schools and 3 new facilities, 3 new campuses for the universities. And we established, for instance, 10 orchestras in the poorest communities in the city. So we knew that by doing so, Mexico was laying down the foundation for a prosperous future, not only for Mexicans, but also for the people living in the dynamic US border in this region. So I do believe, my friends, that in order to complete the task and the effort, Mexico must persevere, and that the United States should also maintain its support to this endeavor. That is quite important. So, dear friends, in order to conclude and take some of your questions, let me say that thanks to the bold steps taken, by the end of my term in office, the world looked to Mexico with renewed confidence. For instance, the New York Times published op-eds about how Mexico got back in the game. Forbes magazine talked about the Mexican miracle. The IMF about Mexico's comeback. And The Economist made in last November, a whole issue related to the rise of Mexico. But the truth is that, as with any other worthy goal, building a strong competitive economy has taken many years of passionate work and coordinated effort by firms, workers, and the government. And to ensure economic success, Mexico must persevere on the path of economic reforms and financial discipline that mark my term. It is very positive that the administration of President Peña has moved forward towards important reforms in telecom and energy sectors, and education as well. But at this point, it has to be noted that the political conditions that are allowing the approval of such reforms are completely different to those I faced while in office. For instance, the party in power now, the PRI, strongly opposed any constitutional reform in the energy sector when I proposed that, and also rejected the idea of changing the law to allow Pemex, the state of a company, to establish alliances with private firms. Now in office, the PRI is a staunch supporter of this and other change. That's good, anyway. And I don't want to comment on if there are any changes in the government, but I can assure you that what has really changed in Mexico is the opposition. My party, the PAN, is acting as responsible, constructive opposition. It has both the legislative votes and the political willingness to support common sense energy reform, for instance. And this is very important for Mexico, as our future depends on the ability to the country to produce oil, gas, and electricity at competitive prices. Let me tell you some figures about the potential. In terms of shale gas, of shale oil, for instance, along with Venezuela, we have the 7th largest potential reserves and resources, shale oil. In terms of shale gas, Mexico has resources comparable to those of Canada and the United States. And actually, the potential reserves of shale gas in Mexico will be as bigger as the reserves of Texas state, and very similar to the reserve of the United States as a whole. So we are like the 6th or the 7th potential reserves in the world. As you can see, if approved, the energy reform will open tremendous opportunity for investment in Mexico, something that I am sure would be very attractive for many global companies, some of them Texas-based in oil and gas firms. So if the government wants to see the energy and other economic reforms approved, it is crucial that it takes into account the demands of the opposition, which is asking at least for two things on my understanding. One, important reforms to curb corruption and promote greater transparency and accountability in public finances, something badly needed at local level in Mexico. This effort implies continuity in the steps taken during my term to renew local law enforcement and judicial institutions. And second, a bold political reform in order to assure that the electoral abuses of the past never will come back to the country. These are, on my view, understandable demands that will benefit Mexico. Dear friends of the Houston World Affairs Council, amigas y amigos queridos, it is clear for me that the future of Mexico and the U.S. relies in our capacity to act together, not only to solve our common challenges, but also to boost our strengths in order to build a more secure, prosperous, and integrated North American region. In Mexico, we have advanced in building a stronger and safer country, a more dynamic and competitive economy. But we know that in this global era, a nation can only succeed if it has the support of its strategic partners. As President Franklin Roosevelt stated in his second inaugural address, in our personal ambitions, we are individualists. But in our seeking for economic and political progress, we all go up or else we all go down. Based in our shared values and common ideals, we have an equal opportunity to forge stronger ties between our countries in the name of economic progress. This is the time to keep up the momentum of recent years and build a new era in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I invite you to continue being responsible, sensible, and active citizens of the world. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Or whatever you want. 3, 4, 2, 5, or something like that.
Thank you, everybody. We do have time for a couple of questions, so please stay seated. You referred to Mexico's oil and gas sector. Can you expand a little bit further on what the challenges might be to achieve what the government and yourself has in mind?
Yeah, well, the crucial point is that Pemex badly needs the participation of the market and the private investment in order to get the full potential of our reserves and our resources. Why? The state-owned company has not the right incentives to do that, has not the right incentives to be efficient, has not the right incentives, for instance, to stop the demands of the union, which sometimes are far beyond the justice. Mexico and Pemex needs financial support to do so, and it's not only a question of money. Pemex needs, for instance, the operational capacity that only the market and private companies could provide, because it is impossible to decide from one single desk in state-owned industry. It is impossible to take all the decisions that the efficiency demands. And it's impossible to bear all the risk associated with oil exploring and production. You can see very important argument we used 2008 and the government is using correctly this year. You can see every single year in the border, the region is exactly the same. So the oil and gas fields doesn't respect the borders, if I can say that. Nature is different than the political geography. So the potential in Texan side, it's equal to the potential in Tamaulipas or Coahuila side. But in this side, the American side, there are like 1,000 wheels every single year producing oil and gas. And in the Mexican side, we have only 30 wheels a year, by far. So how can we use all our potential? The only way is to allow some mechanism in which Pemex and Mexicans, we as owners, will get all the benefits and extract all the rent from those resources, meanwhile having very efficient way to produce that. It is impossible to do in the way we are doing so. And with this revolution of shale gas, either Mexico gets the opportunity and jump into the future, or we will lose again a tremendous opportunity. Because in the future will be irrelevant probably to have such amount of reserves. Thinking this, everybody says that the United States will not import oil by the year 2020 anymore. So what is going to happen with a country like Mexico that is exporting all its oil to the United States? We need to get the advantage. Actually, we are importing natural gas from Texas. And we have plenty of natural gas in our soil. So it's like it should be a very rational decision. And alongside the stream of production, we need the private participation in refinery. Why? Because American law allows private sector. Pemex is investing in refinery in Texas. The Deer Park refinery is owned by Pemex in joint venture with one private company. Why Pemex doesn't do the same in Mexican territory? Because the law doesn't allow Pemex to do so. And it's the best way to produce gasoline. And because of the lack of efficiency of Pemex, we are importing 40% of our gasoline to Mexico, which is absurd. So we need to change that. So I think this is the moment. I don't want to comment in particular the initiative presented by the government. I respect that, but I hope that we will not lose the opportunity again to make the reform that Mexico needs.
Thank you. Obviously very passionate about that. Last question, just to wrap things up. What must the U.S. do to be a better partner and friend to Mexico in the future?
Well, one thing is, well, several things. The list. I think there are a lot of things that Mexico needs urgently from the U.S. Talking about security is to continue the joint effort in order to defeat the crime, but very important things that we are demanding to the American society. I know some of them are very controversial. One is guns and weapons. Believe me, I do respect the American Constitution. I do respect the Second Amendment. I know that the tradition in America is any single citizen has the right to protect himself and his family, and then to own and carry on guns and weapons. I do respect that, and I don't want to change that. But believe me, that is not happening in the border, talking about the Mexican gangs. The truth is that a lot of those guns and weapons are not going to the good hands of the good American citizens. Those guns and weapons are going to the hands of the criminals. And I say in the American Congress a few years ago, either you stop the flow of weapons towards Mexico, weapons that today are aiming against Mexican citizens, or one day those weapons are going to aim American citizens. 1 year later, one of those weapons killed an American officer. During my government, we seized 160,000 guns and weapons. 160,000 could be enough to provide the full army. 85% of them were sold in the United States. I don't want to forbid the right of the American citizen. What I'm demanding is stop the flow of weapons towards Mexico. And you will find a way. it is impossible to me to understand. You have full register for anything. You have full register for vehicles, full register for houses, full register for credit cards. Even if you want to buy an internet song in iStores, they demand all your data, personal data, and what is your name and your passions, and they know everything about you. But if you buy a weapon, nobody knows about you. There is no register. It's like luz y fuerza in that sense. No computers for weapons. That's unbelievable. That's one thing. The other, the trade, and Texas is doing very well. We need to understand that we could be great partners. I know that a lot of American citizens have serious concerns about the competitiveness of America. What is happening in China, India? They are gaining a lot of competitiveness. They are growing really fast, Brazil and others. You know, if we play together, Mexico and the United States and Canada, we could be more competitive than them. We are completely complementary economies. American economy is capital abundant economy. Mexican economy is labor abundant economy. One is large economy, other is small economy. It's like a textbook case of microeconomics. And labor and capital are like the left shoe and the right shoe. You need both to grow. You could try to walk only with one shoe, but you will find a lot of troubles. The only way in which a region could gain competitiveness in this global arena is through combination and complementary combination of those factors. And we have those factors. And that implies, for instance, to have a rational, understandable, comprehensive immigration reform. And let me tell you this, me as president of a Mexican, I don't want to see the Mexican people crossing the border by necessity. Believe me, we suffer that. I came from Michoacán, where most of the people, or a lot of people, came to the States several years ago. And it's painful to see towns and towns only with women, some children, and elderly people. But the bravest of our people, the smartest, the hard workers, they put on risk their lives in order to get better opportunities for their families here. We are not enjoying that, believe me. But one day will be in which no one will be pushed to look abroad for an opportunity. And that is exactly what I tried to do during my presidency. But in order to allow the markets to work in a very efficient way, and with that to promote the efficiency, competitiveness, and even more work for American citizens, we need to understand that we cannot stop the markets by decree. I hope that one day we could see each other as what we really are. We are not enemies. We are neighbors. We are partners. We are allies. And I hope one day we will be seriously real friends between the American and the Mexican people. That could be my comment.
Unfortunately, we could only address 2 questions, but just so that everybody's aware, we received a flood of questions. All of those questions will go to the President's entourage, and they will be received and addressed, so thank you for that. And I guess, Mr. President, on behalf of everybody here, the sponsors, the World Affairs Council, thank you very much for a very insightful and inspirational presentation. And we wish you all the best in the future. And Houston, the community here, will continue, and Texas, of course, be a great neighbor to Mexico in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I will answer the questions if you all want. You with me then? We'll give you, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
If you could just wait a second so the president could leave to his next event, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.